It is April 1984. Something terrifying is about to happen in this Central African country, but the people don't know it yet. Soldiers are parading the streets with guns drawn. They are wearing the country's colors. However, their mission is a national security threat. In a split of a second, tanks appear alongside troops in their numbers. They are heading into the presidential palace in the country's capital. The goal is simple: seize the palace. A soldier soon fires his gun at an oncoming enemy. They used to fight on the same side, but not today. Ambitions have changed their loyalties. Tension is in the air. Power is up for grabs, and if only these marching troops can take down the regime, there will be heroes. But it's not that simple. Even though these rebel soldiers from the Republican Guard have already seized the airport, the national radio station, and are surrounding the presidential palace with President Paul Biya trapped inside, they made one rookie mistake. They assume their broadcast of this coup is reaching every part of Cameroon. However, the radio managers are able to avoid this by a trick that instead transmits the broadcast within only Yaoundé and not in the provinces of the country. Also, while hiding in the palace bunker, President Paul Biya is able to communicate with the armed forces. A unit is soon deployed to defend the president. Soon, the radio stops broadcasting. Nobody knows what's happening. Roads remain blocked. Explosions are heard near the Unity Palace. But Biya is hanging on tight. Soon enough, loyalist troops arrive from other parts of the country. The Air Force bombs rebel positions near the palace, announcing victory over the rebels within 2 days. But they won't give up. Fighting lasts for 3 days. The streets of Yaoundé turn into a war zone. Soldiers firing at each other, civilians hiding under their beds. By April 9th, the coup is finally crushed. Biya walks out of the ashes, clinging onto power by a thread. The people of Cameroon are shaken, but their heart is in the right place. They rally support for the armed forces, but most importantly, for their president. From here, the man who had crawled under his furniture to avoid getting shot by his own soldiers would rise above every law, every opposition, and every dissenting voice to hold on to power for 42 years. Today, no one dares criticize Paul Biya. In fact, any mention of the president's health or whereabouts could lead to jail time or even forced disappearance. But hang on a second, how did he manage to do this? What is the secret behind the rise and reign of this 92-year-old man that has kept Cameroon inside his pocket for 4 decades? This is the story of how Paul Biya captured Cameroon, refusing to let go even after 42 years. With another election coming up this year, 2025, we will look at the tactics the ruling party is using to try and scare the opposition, but most importantly, the people into submission. Buckle up, it's sure going to be a wild ride. Now, you already know that there's no telling the story of Paul Biya without going into the backstory of Cameroon, and that is quite interesting because this country has a very complicated history. It all began in 1884 when this region became a German colony. Even though the British Empire was busy doing its empire stuff around the coast, the Germans were able to lay claim to this piece of land when this guy, Gustav Nachtigal, a German explorer, arrived in July 1884 to annex the Douala coast. Over the next couple of years, the Germans continued to move inland, gradually extending their control and claims. Soon enough, these Europeans began to set up large estates in southwestern Cameroon to provide tropical agricultural products for themselves. Traders, plantation owners, and even government officials competed for labor. But this wasn't some paid labor, no. Brutal force was used to obtain it. This system was cruel. Many workers died serving the Germans. Then World War I broke out and everything was about to change. During the First World War, British, French, and Belgian troops joined forces to drive out the Germans. This began a period of British rule in 2 small areas of Cameroon. The French moved in to claim the remaining territory. This setup was arranged by the United Nations, then referred to as the League of Nations. The mandate basically carved up Cameroon into 2, namely the French Cameroon and the British Cameroon. They were known as trust territories of the French and the Brits. The British Trust territory consisted of a strip of land divided by the Benue River along the eastern border of Nigeria. And just like all British colonies, this place was neglected with no form of development. But the Europeans had a plan for how to profit from the suffering of these people. Eventually, the old German plantations were united into a single government-owned enterprise known as the Cameroon Development Corporation, which also became the mainstay of the economy. With this setup, trade in agricultural products took off. The production of cacao, coffee, and bananas grew rapidly. Some Nigerian traders who lived along this border would eventually move into the British-controlled Cameroon, leading to resentment by the locals. Over in the French-controlled territory, the French established a government similar to what it had done in all of its other African colonies. They invested in agriculture, built schools, hospitals, and a few infrastructures. Even though French Cameroon was better developed than British Cameroon, both were made to serve the colonial powers, producing raw materials for European industries while remaining dependent on Europe, especially France, for finished goods. It was in this dystopian state that Paul Biya was born. 6 years after the birth of Paul Biya, the war descended into another war, when the Germans, still bitter from their defeat in the last one, took on the mission to regain control. Luckily for Bela, he didn't get to fight in this war, as he was instead busy training to be a priest. You see, at 7 years old, his parents sent him into a Catholic mission, roughly 50 kilometers from his hometown. Here, one of Bela's French tutors took note of his excellent performance and decided that the young boy should become a priest. By the time the Second World War came to an end, Bela was admitted to junior seminaries run by the Puritan Catholic fathers. He would go on to study Latin, Greek, and philosophy. Being a brilliant student, Bela soon scaled through secondary school with flying colors and went on to pursue higher education at the University of Paris, but this time he found his true calling. Yeah, it had nothing to do with doing the Lord's work. He instead decided to focus on law and political science. By the time he obtained his law degree in 1960, Cameroon had undergone a whole lot of change, making it unrecognizable from the country he had known as a little boy. You see, shortly after World War II, African people began to rebel against their colonial rulers. For French Cameroon, the movement started in 1948 when a nationalist movement called the Union of the Peoples of Cameroon (UPC) was formed. But the colonial authorities frowned at this. By May 1955, there were mass arrests of activists demanding independence. This gave rise to riots in several cities across the country. As soon as they were declared wanted by the police, the UPC activists vanished into the forest, where they formed guerrilla bands, with others fleeing into neighboring British Cameroon. Soon enough, the world started paying attention. Countries like India, Syria, and the Soviet Union all called out France for its brutal handling of the crisis. But things soon got out of hand. On the 18th and 19th of December 1956, an insurrection broke out among the Bassa people. Several dozen anti-UPC figures were murdered. Bridges, telephone lines, and other infrastructures were destroyed. The French military and native security forces violently repressed this uprising. But this failed to stop the rebellion. Instead, it motivated many native Cameroonians to join the cause of independence and fight in the long-running guerrilla war. To do this, several offshoots of UPC militias were formed and scattered across the country. Although their access to weapons was very limited, they pressed on with guerrilla warfare. Now, the UPC was a multi-ethnic movement, but the pro-independence movement was seen as particularly strong among the Bamileke and Bassa people. Hence, both were targeted by the French for severe repression. Entire villages were burnt to the ground. There were reports of forced relocation and indiscriminate killings. But with international pressure mounting, the French needed to save face. So they reluctantly let go, asking the United Nations to grant French Cameroon independence and end the trusteeship. By the time all formalities were concluded, 1960 had rolled around and French Cameroon became an independent state. With independence secured, this guy, Amadou Ahidjo, became president of the new nation. But there was just this one question that was left unanswered. How about British Cameroon? When French Cameroon gained independence in January 1960, it became the second of France's colonies in sub-Saharan Africa to become independent, the first being Guinea. But this independence was in name only. The new president, Ahidjo, aligned himself closely with France, even had many French advisors and administrators in his government. Most of the country's assets remained in the hands of French companies. This caused a great deal of concern for the people, especially the onlooking people of British Cameroon, who were asked to choose between joining neighboring Nigeria, who were set to gain their own independence later in 1960, or unite with the independent French Cameroon. You see, unlike French Cameroon, the British territory was administered as two separate areas. We had Northern Cameroons and Southern Cameroons. Northern Cameroons consisted of two sections divided by a point where Nigerian and Cameroon borders met and were governed as part of the northern region of Nigeria. Southern Cameroons, on the other hand, was administered as a province of eastern Nigeria. So, when the question was asked about what to do with this British territory, there was no easy answer. However, after some discussions which lasted for close to a year, something called a plebiscite was agreed to. This is simply the direct vote of all the members of an electorate on an important public question, such as a change in the constitution. This plebiscite was held on 11th of February 1961, and the result gave rise to what we have as Cameroon today. The Muslim majority Northern Cameroons saw a majority of 60% vote in favor of joining Nigeria, whilst the Christian majority Southern Cameroon saw 70.5% vote in favor of joining the already independent French Cameroon. Following this result, Northern Cameroon officially became Sardauna province, a part of the northern region of Nigeria, whilst the Southern Cameroons united with independent French Cameroon to become West Cameroon, one of the two federated states of the Federal Republic of Cameroon. Yeah, remember I told you this country had complicated history. But this union was not that simple. To negotiate the terms of this union, the Formban Conference was held on the 16th to 21st of July 1961. John Anglophone, the leader of the Cameroon National Democratic Party and the Southern Cameroon's elected government, represented Southern Cameroons, while Ahidjo represented the independent French Cameroon. After long deliberations, they agreed to a new constitution based heavily on the version adopted in Cameroon earlier that year, but this time with a federal structure granting former British Cameroons, which is now Western Cameroon, jurisdiction over certain issues and procedural rights. Biya became the capital of West Cameroon, while Yaoundé doubled as the federal capital and East Cameroonian capital. Neither side was exactly happy with this arrangement. Ahidjo had wanted a unitary or more centralized state, as this would give him more control over decision making in the new country. The West Cameroonians, on the other hand, wanted more protections for their language and culture. However, they had to settle on a compromise. On the 14th of August 1961, the federal constitution was adopted with Ahidjo as president. Foncha became the prime minister of West Cameroon and vice president of the Federal Republic of Cameroon. But just as the Western Cameroonians feared, this structure didn't last. We have more on that later. Cultural differences and disagreements on power sharing have since led to violent crises of late, something called the Amazonian War of Independence, a topic we are currently making a whole new video on, especially with regards to the oppressive rule of this guy, Paul Biya. And that brings Biya back into our story.
History has not forgotten that Biya was the capital of Southern Cameroon.
In 1962, Paul Biya returned to Cameroon and began his long service as a bureaucrat and administrator in the Ahidjo government. He was placed in charge of foreign development aid and directly reporting to Ahidjo, gaining international financial management experience. Despite differing backgrounds, Ahidjo, a northern Muslim with limited education, and Biya, a highly educated southern Christian with interest in classical music and tennis, they became close. Under Ahidjo, Biya served as chief of the cabinet, secretary general of the presidency, and minister of state, eventually becoming Cameroon's highest ranking minister. But there were cracks in the Ahidjo government, deep cracks that resulted in a lot of tension within Cameroon. Remember the UPC, which was formed during the fight for independence? Yeah, they didn't lay down their arms after independence. They continued to demand a full break with France. Dissatisfaction with the Ahidjo administration, which was viewed as a French puppet, eventually led to armed rebellion. To fight off this rebellion, Ahidjo again turned to the French, who gladly gave him the requested assistance to suppress the UPC rebels in what became known as the Bamileke War. After several months of brutal fighting, the UPC was ultimately defeated, with government forces capturing the last important rebel leader in 1970. In the following years, Ahidjo used emergency powers granted due to the war and the fear of further ethnic conflict to centralize power in himself, building a police state in the process. He implemented a highly centralized and authoritarian government that used every trick in the book to prevent opposition. Anyone accused of compromising public safety was detained without following the traditional criminal process. No right to a lawyer or even an appeal. Ahidjo's regime dished out sentences of life imprisonment at hard labor or death like candies. Executions were often public, breeding a culture of fear. Soon enough, opposition parties were banned. Ahidjo went on to create a one-party state with a strong presidential system, granting him full control over state institutions. Well, seeing that international governments respected elected leaders and frowned at dictators, he organized a sham election on the 28th of March 1970 with himself as the only candidate. He was elected president with 100% of the vote. His government recorded a 99.4% voter turnout. But he wasn't satisfied. To further consolidate his power, Amadou Ahidjo broke the agreement signed when former British Cameroon was reunited with French Cameroon at independence. He changed the federal structure to a unitary state, renaming it the United Republic of Cameroon. Ahidjo argued that this would promote national unity and efficiency. But this was wishful thinking. As it turned out, this new setup became the root cause of the ongoing Anglophone crisis, as it gave more power to the majority French-speaking central government. The English-speaking minority felt colonized by the French-speaking government and their semi-autonomy stripped away, giving all power and decision-making to the central government. The English-speaking people from former British Cameroon were furious, but Ahidjo didn't care. He used a patronage system to ensure loyalty by personally controlling top appointments. Through this all, Ahidjo had Paul Biya by his side, watching and learning. One quality that Ahidjo loved most about Paul Biya was his timid look. Biya came to be perceived as someone without any political ambitions. This would eventually become a weapon. On June 30th, 1975, Ahidjo appointed Biya as Prime Minister of the United Republic of Cameroon. 4 years later, the Ahidjo government passed a law officially declaring the Prime Minister as the constitutional successor to the President. This made Paul Biya the constitutional successor should there be any reason for the President to step aside. Well, that reason came along pretty fast.
Les relations entre le président Paul Biya et son prédécesseur Amadou Ahidjo.
On November 4th, 1982, President Ahidjo resigned in a rather strange circumstance. The official claim was illness. Paul Biya, the then Prime Minister and Vice President of the ruling party, became President of the Republic on November 6, 1982. And that completed his rise to power. But despite resigning his position as President, Ahidjo refused to go away. He retained control of the CNU ruling party, expecting to remain influential in key decision-making. Believing he could bend Biya to his will, Ahidjo perhaps anticipated a return to power after medical treatment. However, this turned out to be a grave political miscalculation. You see, shortly after being declared president, Paul Biya quickly took steps to reshape the country in his own image. He reshuffled the cabinet in June 1983 without consulting Ahidjo. This led to tensions between both men. In August 1983, an attempt was made to remove Biya from power. This coup attempt was linked to Ahidjo, and when it failed, the former president fled to France and publicly accused Biya of abuse of power. Ahidjo then sought to use his control over the party to sideline Biya by causing the party and not the president to set the government's agenda. This move didn't work out so well either. Biya was eventually elected to lead the party, further consolidating his power. In a move to shake off the stigma of being Ahidjo's puppet, Paul Biya called for early presidential elections in January 1984, which he won decisively. This brought the Ahidjo era to an end, although there was just this last move the ex-president had in play. You see, during his rule, Ahidjo had assembled majorly northern Muslim officers to form an elite force called the Republican Guard. Paul Biya, fearing that the force's loyalty might still be with Ahidjo, announced plans to rotate the unit. This single decision gave rise to one of the bloodiest events in the country's history. On the 6th of April 1984, the Republican Guard surrounded the presidential palace with tanks and heavy fire. They occupied the Yaoundé airport and captured the national radio station, which began playing martial music. The rebels immediately cut off the army unit responsible for defending the capital. But after 3 days of brutal fighting, armed forces loyal to Biya quashed this rebellion. The attempted coup of 1984 caused the death of more than 1,000 people, mostly civilians caught in the crossfire. Surviving this coup attempt meant Paul Biya's popularity soared. The people rallied behind him and against every opposition. This began the drift into Biya's lifelong rule. Paul Biya was a brilliant politician who understood what the people needed. He saw the restrictions under Ahidjo's regime and wanted to do better. So he promised to allow political freedom and end the police state created by Ahidjo. But there was one thing that he did that brought all Cameroonian institutions under his control. It was a genius move. Biya revitalized Cameroon's institution by imposing his image on national life and launching what became known as the New Deal concept. The guidelines of this New Deal were political freedom, moralization, and national integration. This New Deal was intended to create a Cameroon characterized by individual liberty, freer exchange of ideas, proper management of public affairs, transparency, and public accountability. It also aimed to eliminate ethnic bigotry. In the early days, it worked. One of the New Deal's goals was to improve the social and economic conditions of the people. With oil becoming a major source of revenue in the early 1980s, Biya financed New Deal programs like road construction and subsidized pricing for farmers' export crops. The government also increased investments in health and education. Between 1984 and 1985, for example, the Ministry of Health's budget rose by 32%, enabling the construction of new hospitals and clinics. The people saw Biya as the best thing to have happened to Cameroon. He knew how to get his way with words. He paid visits to the Anglophone region of the country, making promises that brought smiles to every face. Despite these early successes, Cameroonians soon realized that something was just not right, and they began to lose faith in the New Deal. You see, within 2 years of taking office, Biya made a bold move. He changed the country's name to the Republic of Cameroon, the same name it held upon independence in 1960. Anglophones were furious. Their leaders said they had not been consulted or warned in advance. They viewed the change as an attempt to erase their identity and forcefully assimilate them into the French-speaking majority. But Biya did little to quell these fears. After the failed coup of 1984, Biya understood that if he needed to rule for as long as he wanted, he had to consolidate and centralize power as much as possible. To do this, he began rewarding loyalists and punishing those who opposed him. He started investing heavily in the military, creating multiple divisions and placed people loyal to him at the top of the different military divisions. He struck a deal with the Israeli government where Israeli forces were charged with training the presidential guard. He bought foreign weapons, expanded and greatly improved the air force. He also strengthened diplomatic relations with multiple countries such as Israel, France, and the United States. In 1985, Biya rebranded the CNU as Cameroon People's Democratic Movement, CPDM. Soon enough, the president began restricting free speech again and grew reluctant to implement many of his initial promises. Meanwhile, the economy began deteriorating. Oil prices crashed, and the value of key exports like cocoa, cotton, coffee, and palm oil also fell. Beginning in 1987, Cameroon's economy shrank for 9 consecutive years. Poor economic management only made matters worse. To his credit, President Biya admitted the country was in crisis, but instead of thinking of a solution that will help his people, he turned to the IMF, whose structural adjustment programs and budget cuts further made life difficult for Cameroonians. The people soon became frustrated when they realized that their economy had remained dependent despite decades of independence. Conditions worsened and corruption became rampant. Cameroon even came to be ranked as the most corrupt country in the world at some point. This soon gave rise to strong opposition movements across the country. In the late 1980s, many African countries began adopting democracy. This inspired louder calls for political change in Cameroon. In 1989, Attorney Yondo Black formed a major new political party, initiating a national shift toward multi-party politics. But Biya's government cracked down on this movement and hard. Yondo Black and fellow organizers were arrested and charged with destabilizing the government and promoting ethnic tension. However, Black's arrest only fueled more opposition movements. On May 26, 1990, John Frundi, a native of the northwest region of Cameroon, one of the two English-speaking regions of the country, officially launched the Social Democratic Front, SDF, in Bamenda. Even though the party's public launch was banned by the Biya government, Frundi and his supporters went ahead anyway. The rally was violently repressed by security forces. 6 people were killed and numerous arrested in a movement that galvanized opposition to the regime and made the SDF a national symbol of resistance. This bold defiance sparked the movement for multi-party democracy and placed Frundi and the SDF at the forefront of the opposition. Anglophone students at the University of Yaoundé demonstrated in support of the SDF and political reform, but the Biya regime fought back, falsely accusing the students of advocating for reunification with Nigeria, claiming they sang the Nigerian anthem and raised its flag. In fact, some leading members of Biya's party harshly condemned the Anglophones for what they called treacherous actions. By April 1991, tensions between opposition groups and the government intensified. Between April 10th and April 15th, 8 pro-democracy demonstrators were killed and several others were wounded. In retaliation, on June 25th, the opposition declared a mass general strike across Cameroon under the name Operation Ghost Town. The goal of the strike was to shut down every city in the country. The opposition sought to paralyze the national economy, cut off support for civil servants, and pressure the government to end Biya's regime and introduce democratic reforms for future elections. But Paul Biya saw this coming. He launched a brutal campaign against his own people. The government deployed the military to re-establish public order. These soldiers were stationed in 7 of the 10 provinces and over several months used excessive force against protesters. Simultaneously, the government launched a sweeping crackdown on the press. Biya's administration established a new censorship authority to monitor media content. Independent newspapers were confiscated. Dozens of journalists staged a peaceful march protesting the bans, but the authorities cracked down even harder. Several journalists were injured during confrontations with security forces and nearly 40 were detained. By October 1991, the strike had begun to take its toll. Opposition groups and businesses struggled financially, and everyday citizens faced increasing hardship due to lack of access to goods and services. The Biya's government, on the other hand, had help from abroad. France retired part of Cameroon's debts and twice arranged for government officials to receive back pay. Additionally, the IMF sent millions of dollars for economic restructuring. These aid packages helped Biya maintain a facade of control. Over time, the government's violent suppression of protests, the perceived ineffectiveness of the strikes, and its financial stability pushed many opposition parties to accept negotiations, but this time on Biya's terms. In late October, a national conference was convened, bringing together government officials, opposition parties, media representatives, religious leaders, business stakeholders, and trade unions. However, Biya still refused to allow any reforms ahead of upcoming elections. Despite these disappointments, by late November, 41 political parties had signed an agreement with the government. The Social Democratic Front, SDF, notably refused. By the end of 1991, Cameroon had as many as 70 political parties, each fighting for its own interest. this lack of unity would later work in favor of Biya. The final outcome came with the presidential elections held in October 1992. Following a campaign marred by intimidation, violence, fraud, and electoral irregularities, Paul Biya won with just 40% of the vote. His two main opponents, who together earned 55%, split the opposition vote, allowing Biya to claim victory. Although many believed the election was rigged, Biya had the crucial backing of France, the former colonial power. France, with extensive cooperation agreements in place, had strong economic interests in Cameroon, hence wanted Biya's continued rule. Foreign aid and international support gave Biya the resources he needed to remain in office during this difficult period. Well, after winning this election, Biya swiftly implemented tactical and structural strategies to retain and centralize power even more. He used repressive tactics such as arrest of opposition leaders and activists, harassment of opposition parties, including obstruction of rallies and manipulation of media coverage. There's also state control of media, especially CRTV, which limited opposition voices and sang praises to the Biya regime. Biya also used constitutional engineering to remain in power. Like in 1996, the constitution was revised to give the president more power and amend the presidential mandate. Biya expanded executive powers, including control over the appointment of governors, mayors, and even local councils. He created a Senate and Constitutional Council, but they remained inactive for years. He gave the president sweeping powers in cases of emergencies. The most ambitious move of all came in 2006 when Paul Biya abolished presidential term limits. This constitutional amendment allowed him to run indefinitely with 7 years per presidential term. This triggered mass protest, particularly violent in cities like Douala, which were heavily suppressed with dozens killed. But while Paul Biya remained obsessed with staying in power indefinitely, a crisis was brewing in the Anglophone region of the country. Since independence, the Anglophone population has staged numerous protests over what they perceived as economic and institutional discrimination, marginalization, and inequality in public appointments. These tensions frequently led to violent outbreaks, especially when government forces tried to suppress peaceful protests. In October 2016, Anglophone lawyers went on strike, protesting the appointment of Francophone magistrates who spoke no English and were untrained in common law to courts in Anglophone regions. During peaceful demonstrations in Bamenda and Buea, lawyers were manhandled by security forces. Teachers soon joined the strike, demanding that the government stop assigning Francophone teachers to Anglophone schools to teach subjects other than French. These protests escalated into armed confrontations between secessionist groups and the national military. According to reports, the conflict has killed between 6,000 to over 12,000 people and displaced more than 500,000 since fighting broke out in 2017. Civilians, especially public service personnel and traditional leaders, have been frequent targets on both sides. This is an ongoing crisis that we are currently tracking and making a report on. We should have a comprehensive story on this available in the coming months. But how has Paul Biya managed to remain in power in spite of all of this crisis? The Biya regime has used the ruling party as a tool to consolidate and centralize power. The president rewards those who align themselves with the party and speak highly of him. The regime also uses state funds and authority to maintain and control every part of the government, like the country's judicial, executive, and legislative bodies. Cameroon has two branches at the legislative level, the Senate and the National Assembly. The Senate, which is the upper house, has 100 seats. Out of these 100 senators, the president gets to, appoint 30 senators by himself. The remaining 70, 7 per region, are indirectly elected by an electoral college. 94 of the 100 senators are affiliated with the Cameroon People's Democratic Movement, that is the ruling party. All 70 indirectly elected seats went to CPDM in the 2023 elections. Additionally, 24 of the 30 presidential appointees are CPDM members, with the remaining 6 seats distributed among various opposition parties with ties to the ruling party. Now, moving on to the National Assembly, which is the lower house with 180 seats. As of the February 2020 legislative elections, the CPDM secured 152 of the 180 seats in the National Assembly. Its closest ally, the UNDP, holds 7 seats. The remainder is made up of various opposition parties. According to the Cameroonian constitution, the president can enact laws and even dissolve the National Assembly. Paul Biya also has the power to refer matters to the Constitutional Council, which can review a law's constitutionality, but only at his request. And that brings us to the judiciary. Cameroon's Supreme Court consists of 15 judges in total, 9 titular, which are full judges, and 6 surrogate or alternate judges. All Supreme Court judges are appointed by the president, who is also the chairman of the Higher Judicial Council and leader of the ruling CPDM. In the executive arm, Paul Biya regime appoints all 10 governors to govern all the 10 regions of the country, 58 senior divisional officers for the 58 divisions in these regions, and 306 divisional officers to head over the 360 subdivisions in the country. But this state capture goes beyond just political positions. Chiefs and traditional rulers are highly respected in rural and ethnic communities. However, Paul Biya has somehow captured this respected institution as well. He ensures their allegiance to the CPDM by granting them honorary positions or national medals, providing financial incentives, vehicles, housing, or infrastructure development. He also threatens dismissal of these chiefs who support opposition parties. In many regions, chiefs publicly campaign for CPDM and even pressure villagers to vote for the ruling party during elections. This arrangement means Paul Biya doesn't need to campaign vigorously to win elections. Sometimes he doesn't even need to be in the country to rule, as his minions are everywhere reporting back to him. And that reminds me, do you know that Paul Biya spent at least 4.5 years of his first 35 years in office outside the country? According to an investigation by the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, Biya prefers to spend a large portion of his private trips at this 5-star Intercontinental Hotel in Geneva, which offers a swimming pool and striking views of Lake Geneva and Mont Blanc. But he does not travel alone. His wife, Chantal, accompanies him on nearly every trip, as does an entourage of up to 50 people that includes ministers, bodyguards, butlers, and various other staff. According to conservative calculations based on publicly available hotel room prices and a compilation of entourage lists, the total hotel bill of Biya and his colleagues for one stay at Intercontinental adds up to around $40,000 per day. At that rate, the cost of all of the president's private trips, which are 1,645 days in total, would add up to about $65 million in his first 35 years in office alone. This amount does not include food, entertainment, and the rental of a private plane. Here is a graph showing an analysis of Biya's trips abroad. While 1984 did its best to keep Biya at home to his people, he seemed to find his way around in 2009. There were no data in 1997, 1999, and 2001. Yeah, this guy sure loves to travel a lot. I wonder if he would do better as a travel blogger. Who knows? Now, when Paul Biya travels, he does so in style. Reports even claim that the president attempted to buy a brand new private jet in 2004, but his staff somehow managed to cut corners on the deal, leading to a purchase of a defective plane covered by a fresh coat of paint that nearly crashed on his first flight. Well, since then, Biya doesn't want to die doing what he loves the most, so the president has chartered at least several private aircraft since that time. One notable hire was a luxury jet formerly owned by the government of Kazakhstan. Since travel by chartered plane isn't cheap, the bills are, well, staggering. Invoices from 2010 apparently sent by a company called CS Aviation to the director of the President Biya's civil cabinet and reviewed by OCCRP billed the civil cabinet nearly $855,000 for one round trip for 50 passengers from Yaoundé to Geneva and back. Other invoices show that in 2013, the plane was kept on standby for 2 weeks at a daily cost of nearly $157,000. At this rate, the cost of Biya's flights for his first 35 years in office could add up to at least 117 million US dollars. This is quite ridiculous for a country struggling with poverty. And for a growing number of Cameroonians, Biya's extended rule has gone from a symbol of stability to an emblem of stagnation and missed opportunities. Little wonder then why this guy, Maurice Kamto, is fighting so hard to remove Paul Biya and his cronies from power. But who is he?
The national president of the Cameroon Renaissance movement,
Maurice Kamto is not exactly a new face in Cameroon's politics. Born in 1954, Kamto is a trained law professor and barrister and the founder of the opposition Cameroon Renaissance movement. He was a member of the International Law Commission of the United Nations from 1999 to 2016. He was one of the two main agents, the other one being Professor Peter Ntamak in the Cameroonian delegation that successfully led the negotiation to resolve the matter of Bakassi, a peninsula disputed with neighboring Nigeria. His decisive contribution helped him to be appointed as Minister Delegate to the Ministry of Justice in 2004. He resigned from the government in November 2011, but right after resigning from the government, Kamto formed a new opposition party, the Cameroon Renaissance Movement. A kick-off meeting of his party, merging multiple parties, was prohibited by the government on 13th of August 2012. But this didn't stop him from pulling his weight in the opposition. In the 2018 Cameroonian presidential election, Kamto ran as presidential candidate for the MRC. President Paul Biya is said to have won in that election in spite of a fiercely contested result process. The entire country watched a strong defense from Kamto's group of lawyers who pointed to the partiality of the Supreme Court of Cameroon, that is, composed of Biya's CPDM party members. Kamto was declared runner-up by the court and said to have received only 14% of the votes. When Kamto challenged the official results and declared himself the winner of that election, he was placed under heavy watch by the regime. On the 26th of January 2019, Maurice Kamto and 200 of his supporters were arrested and locked up in a maximum security prison in Yaoundé, Cameroon. He was later freed on the 5th of October 2019, along with other leaders of his party, a day after the end of the major national dialogue following an official release by President Biya. But this intimidation has persisted ever since then. On the 8th of June 2025, there were reports of law enforcement officers blocking the 71-year-old from leaving his apartment building in the main city of Douala for a meeting with members of his Cameroon Renaissance Movement party. This house arrest, which lasted 2 days, is another effort by the Biya regime to intimidate opposition voices. As the 2025 race begins to heat up, Kamto's eligibility to run for the presidency remains in doubt because Cameroonian law demands that any political party must already have elected representatives in place if its leader wishes to run for president. At the last presidential election, Kamto's CRM party had one senator, but going into this election, it has no elected officials. Parliamentary elections that were also supposed to take place earlier this year have been delayed until 2026. Whether or not this was a tactic to keep Kamto out of the race, we will never know. The presidential election is set to hold in October 2025, and Kamto has promised that he would protect Biya and his family if he wins the October's election. But will this happen? Can Cameroon really be free of this man whose shadow looms so large over the nation that it seems almost like a cult? I guess only time will tell.